I've written a really nice 3,500 word paper for Mark, but I'm probably going to let this talk be driven by the PowerPoint. Okay, I'm on really thin ice today because I'm standing here as a result of corridor conversations with Mark, whose office is right next to mine in DA4. And we've been talking about Indigenous overrepresentation in the criminal justice system for some time. And I'm a kind of born-again anthropologist. I actually started life as a marine scientist, but over the last kind of 25 years been reinventing myself as an anthro. And I really love the way that anthro can help us to understand very complicated problems. And so I'm quite a keen advocate of the discipline in that respect. We've been talking about the fact that, you know, places like Cleveland Youth Detention Centre have something like 80% Indigenous clients in it, and that's just crazy. And so, as somebody who works a lot on culture, but not in Australia, I'm kind of taking a little bit of a risk here. But I do know that there are some really important similarities between the cultures of the people I've been working with and among for the last 25 years. That's the people of Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea and the Indigenous people of Australia. So I want to talk about that for the first part of my talk, and then I'm going to segue into some safer stuff about inequality. Okay, so and they're very strongly connected, these two lenses that I want to look through. And also acknowledging that the cultural lens is very tricky in Australia because there's such a vast range of changes that are levels and extents of change that have happened to Indigenous people in this country in terms of the key thing that I want to talk about, which is economic personhood. Right? Economic personhood is the way people think and behave economically, particularly in relation to capitalism, which is the dominant economic system that we're all deeply embedded in. Okay? So I'll start off with that, and then I'm going to sort of move into some stuff about inequality. But here's the data. Mark kindly pointed me to some sources that just give us some idea of the extent of the problem. I've redone the labels here because they're super tiny on the actual graph, but you can see you know, the relative proportions of Indigenous people involved in these various categories of crime in Queensland, and you know, it's quite stark with when we remember that Indigenous population is 4.6% of the state. So you know, it's all pretty wildly out of proportion. So let's go to Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands. These are really interesting places to think about in terms of the fact that we have very similar aspects of culture, but very starkly different histories in terms of the colonial experience that these people have had. So they inhabit nation states, post-colonial nation states that enshrine customary land rights, right? So they haven't been displaced like most Australian Indigenous people have. And they exercise almost full sovereignty over their land up there. And those rights are enshrined in the constitutions, in the post-colonial constitutions of those nation states. Second and more important thing is that status and prestige in these societies are acquired by giving away wealth, not accumulating it. So that's the key difference, and that's the commonality with the Australian Indigenous cultures. Now, Melanesians are more sort of clearly in their economies are more clearly sort of centred around a gift system, which is about very clear and very ritualised redistribution, which focuses very strongly on pigs, which we don't have by and large in mainland Australia, but we do in Torres Strait. And most people live a largely subsistence lifestyle. So for that reason, And I'll give you a couple of examples to sort of really flesh it out. But for that reason, most people up there don't do capitalism, right? They don't do it. They really struggle to be capitalists, to behave as possessive individuals. And for that reason, most of the businesses, most of the enterprises are run by other people, e.g. Chinese people, especially Chinese people, right? You go to Fiji and it's more Indians, because Indians were moved there by the British back in the colonial period. So this guy on the right is the skipper, and the guy on the left is the owner of the business of this ship that I once travelled on. Okay, so we go backwards 12 years, and a really interesting event happened in Honiara. I arrived on Easter Monday while Chinatown was being burnt down and looted by Solomon Islanders, by indigenous Solomon Islanders. Why? It's complicated, but basically there was a sort of a crescendo of a trigger that had taken place politically that resulted in long-standing tensions between Solomon Islanders and the Chinese population who inhabited Chinatown in Solomon Islands. And they erupted into violence. And you can see from this aerial shot that Chinatown, quite a big part of Honiara, is being burnt down. The key reason is that the Chinese, as I just said, are merchants. Culturally, they are merchants. They're people who buy and sell, who accumulate material wealth, monetary wealth, and they're good at that, while Melanesian Pacific Islanders and other Polynesian, even Polynesian Pacific Islanders, are under a lot more pressure when they have an economic surplus to give it away, right? And they give it away in order to elevate their status. So there's just a nice shot of a chopper, an Aussie chopper, dropping off some armed personnel in response to that outbreak of violence in Honiara. This is in Auki, where I was busy working on a big survey. So, it was quite a big drama, just give you, some inkling of the magnitude of the drama in that very small corner of the planet. All right, so here we go. Pigs, and in this particular island group, the Lihir Island group in PNG, yams. These are the status items that are given away at a feast. So the key sort of centre of ritual life in this part of the world is mortuary feasts. When somebody dies, everyone gets together and they give stuff away, mainly these two prestige items. In wetter parts of the country, it's taro. But either way, the key thing is that people are giving stuff away. So one really interesting thing that I observed working on the social and cultural, social and economic impact of a dirty great big gold mine that kicked off in 1997 in the Lihir group was the capture of what we might refer to as market wealth flowing from the gold mine in the form of royalties, compensation and wages to Lihirian people. They captured that wealth, and what did they do with it? They were getting a lot of money, huge amounts of money, and it was actually relatively well and evenly distributed through the island group. Did they reinvent themselves as business folk? Did they set up trade stores or transport services or things that require the management of capital and the making of profit? No, they didn't. What they did was they bought pigs, right? They bought pigs with cash. So this is a really interesting intersection of these customary redistributive economic system and the market economy. All right, they bought pigs and they ran out of pigs on Lihir, so they had to fly to other parts of Papua New Guinea to get more pigs, right? So remember that this is how you achieve prestige, and it's competitive, right? So this is mainly men doing this, and they're competing for prestige through this venue, right? So they were flying all over Papua New Guinea with their big bags of cash, buying pigs from everywhere and anywhere, flying them back in the plane, paying air freight, right? With the pig in the plane, that's why I'm calling it flying pigs in the paper, and presenting them at feasts and making damn sure everyone at the feast knows that I've bought this pig in Madang or Leh or wherever and flew it back here, and it's worth an absolute lot of money. And everyone notes this down, and that person, the person who gave the thing away, their status is elevated in everyone's mind. There is no accumulation of material wealth involved, right? All that food is redistributed and consumed at the feast. Everyone goes home with nothing, right? Except a full belly and a good feeling. So that is something that is common to Australian Indigenous cultures. They don't accumulate material wealth. Okay, so this is what I'm getting to. And that is an ongoing problem when they're surrounded by capitalism and they are under pressure to behave like capitalists. There is this cultural entropy, which has a very long history, right? Which is putting pressure against that mandate to behave like possessive individuals. All right, so notwithstanding that, everyone in the Pacific and Melanesia is wanting to engage with markets, global markets, and they want to buy stuff, all sorts of stuff, phones, imported food, cars, boats, whatever. So they need to get cash. So they are sort of meshed into the global market economy. And this is my second case study, which just gives you a little inkling of the pressure, again, social pressure to redistribute. People have to put these signs. If you're running a trade store, you have to put this sign that says no credit. So in Fijian it's sasenga na dinao. Dinao means debt in Fijian, and actually interestingly that word has been borrowed by Papua New Guineans and it's now part of Papua New Guinea talk pisin. So you get the same word there. Right, so why? Because people come up to them and they say, oh, just give me some freebies, come on, And that pressure, that cultural pressure to be generous is really, really strong. And this is the thing about humbug, right? You've got humbug in Australia. It's the same thing. So when people are humbugged, the pressure to comply is powerful. And that makes it really difficult to fit in with this possessive individual cultural mode of economic behaviour. Here's a couple more signs. So dinao for another Papua New Guinean one. There's a Solomon Island one, no credit. There's another word they use in Solomon's, kaoni, which means account. Don't pay half, don't pay a little bit, no, don't finish it tomorrow. No credit. All right, so it's a kind of it's a preemptive defence against this strong cultural pressure to be generous, to share. All right, so that puts Australian Indigenous people into a marginal position in the settler economy, right, in the capitalist market economy. And it means that they experience economic inequality much more harshly than everyone else does. Rich people do experience inequality according to Wilkinson and Pickett and Michael Marmot. And I will just say, I'm going to give you some stuff about Pickett and Wilkinson and Pickett and Marmot, and what I love these people's work, right? Marmot's an Aussie, but he's been working in the UK for a long time. Wilkinson is a Brit. Wilkinson and Pickett are Brits. But they've done this big data work, okay? So anthropologists have been working on inequality, I will just say, in defence of our discipline since at least as far back as the 50s. Lots of work on inequality, right? But not as good at marketing it, and then the second anyone does anything big data, you're in like Flynn. Everyone pays attention. So these folks have done the big data shtick, and it's great, right? I love it, and I give this stuff to my students. But you can see there are these really, just before I go on to the actual correlations, Wilkinson and Marmot are both knights. They're both sir, which I find just ridiculously ironic, given that they both work on inequality. But there you go, whatever. I still love their work. So they've created, Wilkinson and Pickett have created this beautiful index of sort of social problems, right? Social ills, and they're a sort of a whole melange of health and other sort of social issues, and of course they include crime, right? So you've got homicide there, you've got violence, you've got a lack of trust, you've got substance abuse. And they all correlate really powerfully with inequality. And they've done this for all the OECD countries, all the rich countries, and they've also done it for states within the US, and I'll give you some of those in a minute, but meanwhile, here is one of the most powerful graphs. I sort of cobbled this together from two graphs. This is Thomas Piketty's sort of historical trajectory of inequality in the USA through the 20th century, and underneath you've got executions in the USA, right? I mean, I don't think you'd get a better match than that. It really, really tells the story to me. So, you know, we don't actually, well, we have, you know, colossal inequality at the moment. And no, I can't explain why it's gone down towards the end there, but just watch this space, I guess. Anyway, so just to unpack some of that stuff in a little bit more detail, trust, here you see the correlation. Singapore sort of comes in and out of these graphs, by the way, Mark. So I think sometimes they have data and sometimes they don't. There's the comparison among the states of the US. Same thing, right? Same pattern. Mental illness, same deal. Some of the correlations are tighter than others. There's Australia punching above our weight with drug abuse. But again, you know, it's still fitting fairly well with the broad correlation. This is a really interesting one here. So we have some outliers on this graph. This is homicide. All right, so what are the outliers? Well, there they are, and you can explain them quite easily. Right, so Finland is actually a nation state that has a very high rate of gun ownership, along with, of course, the USA. And Singapore, very low. So that, according to Wilkinson and Pickett, explains the fact that these three nations sit well off the trend line here. And there it is for the states. And of course, there are many other factors and covariables. Some testosterone is probably easily one of the most important ones. Here's what I like to think of as the testosterone graph. But the really interesting thing about this is also from Wilkinson and Pickett's book. They're comparing England and Wales versus Chicago for homicides. You see female down here, pretty much nothing, and that's the male graph. They match in shape almost perfectly, but in scale, one's an order of magnitude times 3 different than the other. Why? Well, I would say two things: inequality and firearms. That explains the difference. All right, so there's also in Melanesia a huge amount of violence, and this, I just want to give you this stuff by way of conveying the complexity of these issues. Violence driven by perceptions of inequality in Papua New Guinea, combined with patriarchal culture and a lot of beliefs about sorcery which typically demonise women as the perpetrators of sorcery. So something bad happens in a community which is experiencing a lot of inequality. There's a lot of really angry young men hanging around who don't have a job. They're really pissed off about the fact there's money flowing everywhere. They can't get any of it. And they blame a woman, sorcerer, and unspeakable violence. So you get a bit of an idea here. This was a story done by Joe Chandler and a photographer a few years ago. But, you know, I just give it to you by way of getting some idea of the huge level of violence in Papua New Guinea. And it's very largely driven by encounters with inequality, elevated inequality. So there's a nice quote from the Chandler article about, it's coming from a priest who's been living in that community for a very long time, and he's just saying, look, most young people are unemployed. They went to school, but there's no jobs for them. This is a sort of an intrinsic feature of that nation's economy. And they feel entitled not to have to go back to gardening, which is a lot of grinding hard work, you know, subsistence farming, but there's nothing else for them, and they're angry. And they express that anger in all sorts of awful ways. So mining and logging both drive this sense of inequality in Melanesia, but there are a few kind of little tiny rays of sunshine, and I'll just say this person here you can't see is a female who drives this truck at Lahir. So some tiny number of women benefited in a significant way from the mining work, but most end up bearing the brunt of male anger at experiencing inequality, and there's quite a lot of violence tends to increase in the wake of mining across most of the mining projects in that part of the world. So my last slide, just to sort of sum up, cultural incompatibility to the dominant mode of capitalist possessive individual economic behaviour contributes to the creation of economic inequality, which drives major negative social impacts on Indigenous people. For younger males especially, this leads to high levels of violent crime, which you saw in the first graph, and of course high levels of incarceration. So I'm just giving you this stuff by way of hopefully starting a conversation with the criminal justice community about things like culture and the need to understand culture better, so that we don't get sucked into awful racist stereotypes, and we can try to dismantle those wherever they are, and stop constructing Indigenous people, for example, as intrinsically lazy or violent or criminal or whatever, because they aren't. They're dealing with what we call in anthropology structural violence, and that's a big bad problem. I'm not saying I can solve it right now, here and now, of course I can't, but you can't fix something until you understand it, and I'm just trying to give you this stuff by way of, I might be talking to the converted, I don't know, but I'm hoping that this might be able to start some kind of a conversation about the drivers of criminal behaviour in this part of the world. So the cultural stuff is a little bit tricky and complicated because of the colonial history here. That's why and I don't work with Indigenous people in this country, right? So I'm safe talking about Melanesian people, and I know that there is some commonality in terms of those people not being possessive individuals, and likewise Australian Indigenous people are not possessive individuals. They don't behave in that liberal capitalist way. Mark and I have had plenty of conversations about this. So that's that's pretty much a wrap for I think what I want to say today.